My 70-year-old husband cheated on me with a young girl and left me to my fate, stealing everything. But I took it all back. I never imagined I'd be starting over at 72. Not after all the years I had spent building what I thought was a quiet, dependable life with the man I believed would be with me until the very end. By then, I had stopped expecting adventure or surprise. I had made peace with routine. I found comfort in small things, in grocery lists, in the way sunlight touched the floor near our breakfast nook, in the sound of his slippers scuffing against the tile as he walked to make his morning coffee. I thought our love had softened with time, settling into something stable and safe, like a favorite chair with a well-worn cushion. I truly believed we were past the dangers of betrayal, too old, too tired, too anchored to each other for any of that youthful cruelty. But I was wrong. I was so terribly, painfully wrong. It happened slowly, though in hindsight I see how clearly the signs had begun to appear long before I let myself notice them. There was a sudden new cologne that didn't smell like anything he'd worn in our 50 years of marriage. There were late afternoon walks that stretched into hours without explanation. The vague hum of his voice through the bathroom door while he whispered on the phone. He began dressing with more care, grooming his hair differently, even losing weight, which he brushed off as a side effect of eating cleaner. And when I asked, gently, if there was something I should know, he smiled the way he always had when avoiding something. That practiced, shallow smile that looked like reassurance but tasted like distance. His name is Richard, or at least it was. The Richard I knew. The Richard I married in 1970, fresh out of college, still full of promise and boyish charm. He had once written me poems. He used to fall asleep with his hand in mine. We raised 2 sons together, survived the near collapse of our first business, weathered the death of my mother, his back surgery, a recession, and the slow decay of dreams we didn't even speak aloud anymore. He was, I had always told myself, a good man. And maybe that was the hardest lie to give up. The truth finally arrived one cold evening in March, in the form of a voicemail left by accident. He had called me, perhaps meaning to leave a short message about picking up eggs or delaying dinner, but forgot to hang up. What followed was almost 2 full minutes of his voice, laughing, low and intimate, speaking to someone else. A woman, young. I could tell by her voice, by the casual cruelty in her tone, the way she joked about how easy it was to fool an old wife. My heart didn't race. It sank. Deep and low like a stone dropped in a still pond, heavy enough to break whatever surface I had left. I didn't confront him right away. I didn't scream or cry or throw things, though every part of me wanted to. Instead, I sat alone in the living room that night, the house quiet except for the clock ticking on the wall. I stared at the carpet, my eyes unfocused, and tried to remember the last time we had touched without obligation. I couldn't. That realization hurt more than the voicemail. It was proof that he hadn't just betrayed me, he had been leaving me, inch by inch, for a long time already. A week later, he left for good. No dramatic farewell, no suitcase slammed shut in anger. Just a note on the kitchen counter, 3 lines scrawled in pen. I need to find happiness again. I'm sorry. Take care of yourself. That was all. No signature, no explanation. Just an echo of a man who had once vowed to stand by me in sickness and in health, for better or worse. As if betrayal could be softened by brevity. What followed was a kind of numbness I can't fully describe. It wasn't shock, not in the traditional sense. It was more like being trapped in someone else's life, moving through rooms that suddenly didn't feel like mine anymore. I wandered the house aimlessly, I forgot to eat. I stared at photos of us, at weddings, holidays, on the beach in 1986, and wondered when he had stopped loving me. Or worse, when he had started pretending. But the worst came weeks later, when I began going through our accounts and realized just how much he had taken. At first, it was small discrepancies: a credit card charge I didn't recognize, a missing checkbook, an empty drawer in the office. But soon the truth emerged, devastating in its precision. Richard hadn't just left me emotionally. He had been planning his escape for months, maybe years. He had slowly drained our joint savings account. He had closed out an old retirement fund. He had even forged my signature on a property document, transferring partial ownership of our vacation cabin, the one my parents had left me, into his name, and then selling it quietly to cover debts. He left me with barely enough to pay the utilities. I didn't cry when I saw the numbers. I didn't scream. I sat down at the dining room table with every statement I could find, every letter, every password I could recover, and I began to document, carefully, methodically. I opened a notebook, drew columns, made copies, wrote dates. I remembered a phrase my father once used when I was a girl: write it down if you want it to hold. So I did. I wrote it all down. Every theft, every betrayal, every bit of financial erosion he had caused behind my back while still kissing me goodnight. It wasn't rage that carried me forward. It was survival. I reached out to a lawyer, a woman named Clara, recommended by a neighbor, and walked her through the details. She didn't interrupt. She didn't soften the blow. When I finished, she looked at me and said simply, "This isn't abandonment. It's financial abuse, and it's not legal." That was the beginning. Not of revenge. I didn't want revenge, but of reclamation, of dignity, of self, of everything I had built over 50 years and almost lost to the vanity of a man who could not face aging beside me. I would not let him vanish with my history. He could leave, but he would not take my life with him. The hardest part in those early weeks wasn't the silence, though it was vast and unkind. It wasn't the empty bed, or the missing coffee cup that used to wait for him beside the sink each morning, or the way the house sounded too still without the rhythm of his steps. It was the sense that I had become invisible, not just to Richard, but to the world we had once inhabited together. Friends didn't know what to say. Some of them didn't call at all. Others left voicemails full of cautious sympathy and half-questions, as though worried they might touch something too raw. And I understood that. What could they say to a woman who had given her entire adulthood to a man who walked away without a second glance? What comfort can you offer someone whose identity has been dismantled not by death or illness, but by betrayal in slow motion? I didn't ask for pity. What I wanted was clarity. So I got to work. The dining table became my war room, covered in bank statements, legal pads, photocopies, manila folders. Every morning I brewed tea, sat down in my robe, and sorted through the wreckage of our life. I traced the money, transaction by transaction, marking dates, vendor names, unusual amounts. I learned to read between the lines, to spot the small charges that formed patterns: the boutique hotel near the airport, the jewelry store receipt marked as a business expense, the string of ATM withdrawals that didn't match any event I could recall. I printed everything, labeled each page, and kept them in binders Clara had given me. Clara herself became something of a lifeline. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, direct, and free of the kind of patronizing sympathy that often clings to women in my situation. She didn't pat my hand or tell me it would all be fine. Instead, she laid out facts, drew up plans, and made it clear that I was not helpless. "He's banking on your silence," she said one afternoon, after I had shown her the forged documents from the cabin sale. "He's assuming you'll be too ashamed or too tired to fight back." I looked at her across her paper-strewn desk and said, without hesitation, "Then let's make him very wrong." There were court filings to prepare, affidavits to sign, evidence to submit. Clara filed for a temporary freeze on all remaining joint accounts and a petition to review the property transfer. She brought in a forensic accountant, a gentle, quiet man named Ethan, who combed through the financial details like an archaeologist. He uncovered things I hadn't even noticed. A second credit card Richard had opened under his name only, a private account used to transfer large sums just before his departure. "He didn't just prepare to leave," Ethan said, flipping through the documents. "He planned to erase you financially." The phrase made me cold, but it also made me determined. At night, I allowed myself no more than an hour to grieve. I would sit by the fire, lit now not for ambience but for comfort, and let the grief come. Sometimes I would speak aloud, not to Richard, but to the air, as though saying the truth out loud would make it less monstrous. "You took everything," I said one night, "but you forgot I built it with you, which means I can rebuild it without you." Then I would close my notebook, wash my face, and go to bed. I began selling what I didn't need: the grand piano that no one had touched in years, the antique buffet table we bought at auction in 1982. I went through closets and drawers, separating what was mine from what reminded me too much of him. I cleared out his study, the shelves of unread history books, the bottles of scotch he had collected, the ugly golf memorabilia. I packed it into boxes and donated most of it. The room became mine. A reading room, bright and uncluttered. A space where I could sit with a novel and remember what it felt like to be alone without being lonely. The days began to take shape again. I scheduled appointments. I cooked real meals, not just toast or soup. I went to the farmer's market and smiled at strangers. The clerk at the bank began to recognize me. I returned to my favorite cafe and brought my quilting with me, letting my hands stay busy while my mind tried to loosen the knots he had left behind. And still, he didn't call. Not once. There was no apology, no denial, no attempt at reconciliation. Through Clara, I learned he had moved into a condo in a newer part of town, paid for in part by the sale of our cabin, now in the hands of a real estate investor. He had registered a new business, something vague involving consulting, and had listed the girl, she was 29, Clara found, as his administrative partner. I wondered if she knew what he had done, if she cared, if she believed he was just a man escaping a bad marriage, and not a man who had quietly gutted a woman's life while she still cooked his dinners and folded his laundry. I thought, at first, that learning more about her would help me understand. I even searched for her online once, late at night, and found a photo. Long, dark hair, high cheekbones, a smile that tried too hard. But it didn't bring me clarity. It brought me nausea. Because I realized that it didn't matter who she was. What mattered was what he had become, and what I would not allow myself to become in response. I refused to be reduced to bitterness. I refused to be defined by what had been taken. Instead, I documented every step, not just for court, but for myself. I kept a journal, not unlike the one I used to keep in my 20s. I wrote about what I was learning, about legal rights, about financial independence, about what happens to a woman when the rug is pulled out from under her at 72. I wrote about resilience, not the kind that gets applause, but the quiet kind that shows up each morning and makes coffee anyway. The case was still ongoing. Clara warned me it could take months, even longer if he tried to delay proceedings. But she was confident. So was I. Not because I believed the court would fix everything, but because I had already started the real work, reclaiming myself. One afternoon, as I walked back from the courthouse after another meeting with Clara, I passed a storefront window and caught a glimpse of my reflection. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself, not because I looked old or tired, but because I looked firm, upright, not hollow, not frail. There was no trace of the woman who had once stood paralyzed in the living room, clutching a note he left on the counter. That woman had mourned, but she had not disappeared. She had simply woken up. It's a strange thing, the way pain reshapes your sense of time. The first few weeks after Richard left felt endless. Each day an expanse of silence, each night a slow, measured grief that seemed to stretch across the hours like fog. But once I found a rhythm, once I immersed myself in documents, appointments, lists, and late-night journaling, the days began to fly, not in joy, but in purpose. It had been 3 months by the time our first court appearance was scheduled. 3 months since I had seen his face. 3 months since my world had cracked and left me standing among the pieces, unsure of what could still be saved. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not like in the movies. There was no grand drama, no gallery of observers, just a few benches, a stern-looking judge, and 2 tables. One for him, one for me. When I walked in, flanked by Clara and carrying my leather folder of carefully prepared documents, I saw him already seated. He didn't rise. He didn't turn. He barely looked at me. And I realized then that the man sitting there was not the husband I remembered, not the man who once cried when our son was born, who held my hand in hospital waiting rooms, who helped me repaint the living room on a whim one summer. That man was gone. Or perhaps he had never been as real as I believed. This new version of Richard wore a suit that didn't quite fit and had the smug calm of someone who thought he had already won. But he hadn't counted on Clara. And he certainly hadn't counted on me. The judge was measured, professional, disinterested in our emotional backstory. And that suited me fine. Clara spoke clearly, presenting the financial documents, laying out the sequence of Richard's actions, the transfers, the forged signature, the unauthorized property sale. She didn't dramatize. She didn't editorialize. She let the numbers speak. When it was Richard's lawyer's turn, a younger man with a slick tone and a forced smile, he tried to pivot the story, to paint Richard as emotionally overwhelmed, someone who had made financial decisions under duress. They even hinted that I had neglected our financial affairs and that Richard had taken initiative in a time of emotional breakdown. It would have been laughable if it weren't so vile. When Clara gestured for me to speak, I stood, not with trembling or vengeance, but with an unwavering steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make accusations. I simply told the truth. I explained the years I spent building that life with him, the hours managing our bills, the documents I'd signed in trust, the things I hadn't questioned because I believed we were in it together. I described the voicemail, the empty account, the forged transfer. But more than that, I described the dignity I had kept, even in silence, how I had done the work he abandoned, how I had not let grief paralyze me. When I sat down, there was no applause, just quiet, and that, in itself, was enough. The hearing concluded with a preliminary ruling, partial freezing of assets, the case proceeding to civil litigation. It wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall he had built around his cowardice. That night, I went home and made a full dinner for myself. Not something quick or convenient, but a full meal. Roasted vegetables, salmon with lemon, a glass of white wine I'd been saving. I lit a candle. Not out of loneliness, but out of respect for the woman I had just been in that courtroom. I sat at the table and said aloud, just once, "You did it." I had expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt something quieter, deeper. I felt anchored. In the weeks that followed, I found myself writing more, not just in my journal, but in long handwritten letters I never intended to send. One to my sons, who had both moved far away and with whom I now shared only occasional phone calls. I didn't tell them everything. They had their own lives, their own children, and I didn't want to burden them. But I wanted to mark this time. I wanted it to exist in ink, somewhere. I wrote one letter to my younger self. The girl who believed love, once given, would be forever safe. I told her what I had learned, not with bitterness, with patience. I began walking farther in the mornings. My neighborhood, once just a blur outside the car window, became a kind of map I walked with new eyes. I started recognizing faces. The man with the dachshund, who always nodded but never smiled. The teenage girl who jogged with two large headphones. I even joined a community writing group held in the back of the local bookstore. Most of the members were younger than me. I didn't say much at first, I just listened. And I realized that rebuilding doesn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up, again and again, until the silence gives way to sound. One afternoon, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name. Inside was a short note written in Richard's handwriting. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to feel alive again. That was all. No apology, no offer of restitution. Just that single cowardly sentence, as though naming his emptiness could justify what he had done. I didn't reply. I folded the note and tucked it into the back of my file of evidence. Not as a memento, but as a reminder. Some people don't leave because you fail them. They leave because they are already failing themselves, and they need to believe someone else is to blame. I would not carry that blame anymore. That night, I took a long bath, washed my hair, trimmed my nails. I put on a soft robe and opened a new book. The windows were open, the air cool, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, a future beginning to unfold, not as something I was owed, but as something I would shape with my own hands. He had taken a great deal from me, but I was taking all of it back, piece by piece, document by document, day by day, and he would not stop me. By the time autumn began to soften the sharp edges of summer, the case had moved into its second phase. Clara called it the disclosure period, but I thought of it as the long, cold truth. It was when everything that had once been hidden, every account, transaction, document, conversation, was pulled out into the light and examined. And though it was painful in places, I welcomed it. There was something strangely empowering about seeing at last the full extent of what had been done behind my back, like turning on the lights in a house you thought was haunted and discovering it was just rats in the walls. Still damaging, yes, but not unknowable, not beyond repair. Richard, unsurprisingly, did not make things easy. His lawyer delayed. There were excuses, misplaced forms, vague objections. Clara remained unfazed. She pushed back firmly, citing deadlines and precedents with a kind of quiet fury I had come to deeply respect. She reminded me, during one of our long afternoons reviewing evidence, that the legal system is not designed to feel fair, only to be methodical. "We are not here to make him feel guilty," she said once, looking over her glasses. "We are here to make him accountable." That distinction stayed with me, because guilt is a feeling. It fades. Accountability is a record. It stays. It was around this time that I began to shift, in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just emotionally, but physically, spiritually. I moved with more intention. I slept better. My voice, which had felt so uncertain in the early days, like it might crack if I spoke too loudly, had settled into something calm and firm. When I spoke to bankers, court clerks, contractors, I didn't apologize for taking up space. I didn't preface every sentence with, "I'm sorry to bother you." I asked questions. I kept records. I followed up. And people responded differently to me. Not with pity, but with respect. One morning, while reorganizing a drawer that had long been filled with clutter, I found an old envelope of photographs, ones I hadn't seen in years. There were pictures of Richard and me in our 30s, laughing on a beach. Others of our sons when they were little, arms sticky with melted ice cream, faces full of trust. I held one photo for a long time, a picture of us at a cabin up north, where we used to spend weekends. I was wearing a red flannel shirt and no makeup. Richard had his arm around me. We looked happy. But as I stared, something shifted in my chest, a gentle, undeniable release. I realized I wasn't mourning what I had lost anymore. I was mourning what I thought I had. There's a difference, and it matters. Because when you stop grieving a person and begin grieving an illusion, the pain becomes lighter. It stops being a wound and becomes a scar. Still there, but no longer open. I boxed up the photos. I didn't throw them away. I wasn't ready for that. But I didn't leave them in the drawer either. I labeled the box and stored it on the top shelf of the guest room closet where it could rest. Present, but no longer in the middle of my life. That same week, I repainted the bedroom. The colour we had chosen together, a muted sage green, had started to feel oppressive, like a memory pressed against the walls. I went with something lighter, a soft pearl grey, almost white. Clean. Quiet. My neighbour's son helped me move the furniture. I bought new linens, donated the old ones. I changed the knobs on the dresser. Small things, really. But each one felt like a declaration. This space belongs to me now. The nights became easier after that. I still had moments of sadness, of anger, of disbelief. But they no longer held me hostage. I could sit with them, acknowledge them, and let them pass without drowning in them. I began writing again, not just in my journal, but in essays I submitted anonymously to a local women's publication. One of them, about aging alone with dignity, was published. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need to. It was enough to see my words out in the world, untethered from my name, but still rooted in my truth. One crisp October morning, Clara called with news. "We're moving towards settlement," she said. "He knows he's losing. He's trying to minimize the damage now." The phrase startled me. He's losing. It had never been about winning for me. Not really. What I wanted was acknowledgement, restoration, and safety. But hearing those words out loud, the quiet recognition that he would not get away with it, brought a stillness to my body I hadn't felt in months. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but the absence of fear. The proposed settlement came through a week later. It wasn't perfect, but it was just. The court agreed to reverse the fraudulent property transfer. I would regain ownership of the cabin, though it would take a few more legal steps. A portion of the stolen retirement funds would be returned, along with interest. And while not every dollar could be retrieved, some had vanished into that vague business scheme of his. The judgment placed a financial lien on his personal assets, ensuring he wouldn't walk away untouched. Clara was pleased. "It's a clean precedent," she said. "It's enough." I nodded. It's enough. But what stayed with me most wasn't the money, or the paperwork, or even the legal language of the settlement. It was the fact that, in the final hearing, Richard had to sit in front of a judge and hear, in plain language, that what he did had consequences. He didn't meet my eyes. He looked down, shifting in his seat, his jaw tight. For a moment, I wondered if he felt shame. But then I remembered. It no longer mattered. Shame was his burden now. Mine had been released. As I walked out of the courthouse for the final time, the wind lifted the ends of my coat, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and fallen leaves. I paused at the steps, watching people pass, cars pulling into parking spaces, a woman scolding a child gently by the crosswalk. Life, moving on, unaware of the small, quiet victory just won. I didn't go straight home. I went to the bakery I hadn't visited since before Richard left. I bought a slice of apple tart and sat at a corner table, the same one we used to sit at together on Saturday mornings. But I didn't look at the empty seat across from me. I looked at the light slanting through the window, at the dust motes dancing in it, at the reflection of my own face in the glass. Older, wiser, still standing. And I smiled. Not because I had won, but because I had returned to myself. The real work began after the papers were signed. Not the legal work, that was mostly behind me now, but the slow, deeply personal labor of rebuilding a life that had been dismantled not by a single act, but by a long series of quiet betrayals. There were no more court dates, no calls from Clara, no envelopes marked official. But in their absence came a different kind of challenge. To look at my days not as something to survive, but as something I could shape on my own terms. For a long time, I had lived in reaction to someone else's decisions, his schedules, his moods, his absences. And I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd shrunk just to keep the peace. Now, standing on the other side of all that, I was faced with a question that felt almost too large to ask directly. What do you do with a life that's finally yours again? At first, I moved cautiously. The habits of decades don't disappear just because a judge says they're no longer necessary. I still reached for 2 coffee cups in the morning. I still paused before turning on a lamp, wondering if he'd be reading nearby. I still found myself checking the time against his old routine, when he would have come home, when dinner would have needed to be ready, when I should have begun listening for the sound of his car in the driveway. But gradually, those instincts dulled. They became faint echoes, more noticeable by their fading than by their presence. And in their place came something new, something quiet and unfamiliar. Choice. I began reclaiming parts of the house that had long felt like his, not because he claimed them outright, but because I had given way. The garage, once filled with dusty tools he never used but refused to part with, was emptied. I donated the rusted equipment, scrubbed the shelves, and turned one corner into a potting station for plants. The television room, once a shrine to his favorite news programs and outdated DVDs, was repainted and turned into a sitting room with soft chairs and a small bookcase where I arranged my favorite novels. I didn't ask permission. I didn't apologize. I made the changes slowly, each one deliberate, like laying bricks in a foundation I intended to keep. Outside, the garden became my sanctuary. I had always tended to it, even when he barely noticed the blooms or commented only on the cost of mulch. But now I approached it differently, not as a chore or obligation, but as something sacred. I planted dahlias that reminded me of my mother. I trimmed the hedge he used to complain about, not because it bothered me, but because I wanted it shaped my way. I spent whole afternoons pulling weeds and moving stones, letting the sun touch my shoulders and the soil settle into the lines of my hands. It grounded me in a way nothing else could. The silence of the earth, the rhythm of watering, the slow, patient work of pruning and waiting. It felt like companionship, not loud or affirming, but honest. Friends began to return, in their own time. Not all of them. Some had chosen sides or stayed silent when I needed them most. But the ones who mattered came back gently, respectfully. Joyce, my neighbour from 3 doors down, started bringing over small things. A jar of marmalade, a clipping from her rose bush, a coupon for a concert at the community centre. We had tea on Thursdays. She never asked for details. She didn't need to. She simply sat with me and talked about the things that made life feel ordinary again. The new bus schedule, the price of eggs, the neighbour's cat that had gone missing and returned 2 days later like a tiny ghost. One afternoon, she said, while stirring sugar into her tea, "You look different, you know. Not younger, not exactly. Just more here." I didn't respond right away, but I thought about it later that night as I sat on the porch and watched the light fade behind the trees. She was right. I had spent so many years shrinking, folding myself into the background of a life that was meant to be shared, that I had forgotten what it felt like to fully occupy space, not to perform, not to appease, but simply to be. And now, with nothing left to lose, I had begun to take up that space again, inch by inch, breath by breath. I also found, much to my own surprise, that I didn't miss Richard. Not the man he had become, certainly, but not even the man he had once pretended to be. What I missed, if anything, was the idea of us, the illusion that we had built something together that could last. But now I saw it differently. We had built something, yes, but I had maintained it. I had carried the weight. And when he found someone else to charm, someone younger and easier to impress, he walked away without hesitation. That realization no longer brought pain. It brought clarity. His departure had not been about me. It had been about his own fear of aging, his refusal to face time with grace, his hunger for reflection in younger eyes. And none of that had anything to do with the woman who stood quietly by his side for 50 years, holding everything together. I was not broken. I was tired. And now, at last, I was free. As the leaves began to change again, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a year before. I booked a small cottage rental upstate, just for a weekend, and went alone. I packed my books, my quilt, a bottle of wine, and a basket of groceries, and I left the house with no plan but to rest. The cottage sat near a lake, the kind of place we had once promised to visit, but never did. I arrived just before sunset, unlocked the door, and stepped inside a space untouched by memory. The quiet was immediate and full. I lit a fire, opened a window, and sat with the stillness like it was an old friend. That weekend, I didn't think about court documents or finances or what people might say. I cooked simple meals, took long walks, wrote in my journal. I sat by the water and watched the wind ripple across its surface like breath. No one asked where I was. No one needed anything from me. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt present. When I returned home on Monday, the house didn't feel heavy. It didn't echo. It welcomed me, like a place that finally recognized me as its rightful owner. I unpacked slowly, folded laundry, put the kettle on. I opened the window to let in fresh air and stood for a while, watching the garden sway with early autumn wind. I was not waiting anymore, not for justice, not for apology, not for permission to belong. The time ahead wasn't a second chance or a reinvention. It was simply life. Mine, at last, without compromise. With winter came a different kind of quiet, heavier, but not empty. The garden folded in on itself, branches stripped bare, the earth firm and cold beneath my boots. I began lighting candles in the evenings, not for warmth, but for atmosphere, for the simple ritual of giving shape to the dark. There was something comforting in the early sunsets, in the thick blankets and slow meals and long hours where nothing needed to happen. It was, in its own way, the season I needed most. A season of consolidation. Not the rush of growth or the urgency of reclaiming, but the stillness that follows when the storm has passed and you are left to survey what remains. And what remained, surprisingly, was enough. The legal battle had ended with clarity, the financial wreckage slowly repaired, the cabin's title returned to my name. Clara called once more, only briefly, to check in, to ask if I wanted to pursue any additional claims. I thanked her and declined. The fight was over, at least the kind that involved paperwork and courtrooms and signatures. What I had left to do now was more difficult. The daily, unseen work of making meaning from the pieces, of deciding what kind of life I wanted to live, not in response to anyone, but from within myself. I found myself waking earlier, not from worry, but from habit and curiosity. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the sky lighten with slow indifference. The world didn't care what had happened to me, and I found, strangely, that this was a kind of comfort. I was no longer at the center of some emotional theater. I was just a person in a house, watching the sun rise, choosing how to spend her day. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I wrote long, meandering entries in my journal. Observations, memories, thoughts that had nowhere else to live. I began collecting them, thinking perhaps I'd shape them into something larger someday, though I wasn't in a hurry. Other times, I baked. Not for anyone in particular, but because I liked the feel of flour between my fingers, the smell of cinnamon in the air, the way warm bread filled a room with presence. Occasionally, I still thought of Richard. Not often, and not with pain. He passed through my mind the way old acquaintances do when a familiar song plays or a certain cologne drifts through a department store. There was no bitterness anymore, just distance. What he had done no longer held me. He was part of the story that brought me here, yes, but no longer part of the story I was writing now. I was surprised, though not entirely, when I received a card in early December. The envelope was thin, the handwriting unmistakably his, slanted, sharp, too careful. I opened it without ceremony. Inside was a short message written on one of those generic holiday cards with a snow-covered cabin on the front. No signature beyond his name. Just a note. Hope you're well. Wishing you peace this season. Richard. No apology. No inquiry. Just a generic gesture, as if he were checking a box, filing a memory. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the card into the recycling bin and went back to the dough I was kneading on the counter. That day, I made 3 loaves, 2 for neighbours, 1 for myself. I walked across the street to deliver them personally, something I hadn't done in years. People smiled, invited me in, asked questions I hadn't expected. And I found, with some surprise, that I didn't mind being seen, not for what had happened to me, but for who I was now. A woman who baked bread and walked across the street with a warm loaf in hand, because she could, because she wanted to, because she wasn't hiding anymore. Later that week, I hosted a small gathering, nothing dramatic, just a few women from the writing group and Joyce and Eleanor from next door. I served tea, the bread I'd made, a pot of butternut squash soup. The house felt full, not in the way it used to during holidays, with Richard's voice echoing from room to room, but in a quieter, steadier way. The conversations were gentle, winding, honest. At one point, someone asked if I'd ever considered publishing what I'd been writing. I shrugged and said, maybe. But in truth, I had already started collecting my essays under a single file name on my laptop. What Remains. I didn't know yet if it was for anyone else, but I knew it was for me. After everyone left and the dishes were washed and the windows steamed over from the warmth, I sat down in the armchair with a blanket over my knees and watched the snow begin to fall. The flakes were soft and slow, drifting with no urgency, no destination. I thought about how much had changed in a year. The woman who once stood stunned in her kitchen, holding a note left by the man she had trusted for most of her life, would not recognize this evening. But I did. It belonged to me. And I no longer needed it to look like anything other than what it was. Calm, solitary, chosen. January arrived with its usual austerity. Short, pale days and long nights that seemed to stretch forever, but no longer in a way that frightened me. Where once the quiet had felt oppressive, now it seemed like an invitation. I had learned how to move inside it without flinching. I had learned to belong to myself again. That month, I began taking a class at the local adult learning centre. It wasn't something I had planned exactly. I had seen a flyer in the post office while mailing a birthday card and taken it down almost absent-mindedly. The course was on memoir writing, 6 weeks long, with no grading and no pressure, just a roomful of people who wanted to understand the shape of their lives through story. I didn't tell anyone I signed up. I simply showed up on a cold Monday morning with a notebook and an open mind. The instructor, a woman in her 60s with a warm but unsentimental voice, began the first session by asking us to write a sentence we had never said aloud before. We had 10 minutes. I sat there, pen hovering over the page, unsure where to begin. Then my hand moved, and the sentence came almost before I realized it. I was never anyone's priority, not even when I deserved to be. I didn't read it aloud. Most people didn't. But I underlined it twice, and when I went home, I copied it into my journal. It stayed with me for days, not because it hurt, but because it named something I had only ever felt in fragments, in glances avoided, in conversations redirected, in years spent managing someone else's world without being asked how mine was faring. That class became a turning point. Not dramatic, not immediate, but quietly persistent. Each week, I wrote another piece. At first, I kept them safe, writing about childhood, about my grandmother's bread recipe, about the first apartment I shared with Richard. But by the third session, I found myself writing about the aftermath, about the voicemail, the note, the silence that followed. Not as a victim, but as someone tracing the lines of a map she had followed too long without knowing where it led. The other students, mostly women like me, divorced, widowed, long retired, began to open up too. There was comfort in our shared language, even when we didn't speak directly. We nodded at each other across the table. We laughed, sometimes unexpectedly, at small, sharp memories. One woman, Nora, had left her husband in her 60s after discovering he had a second family 2 towns over. "You wouldn't believe the energy I got back once I stopped pretending I was shocked," she said one morning. We all laughed, but I felt something shift inside me, a sense that I had joined not a club, but a lineage. Outside of class, my life remained quiet, but it no longer felt small. I read more than I had in years, everything from old classics to new memoirs that had been recommended in group. I spent more time with Joyce and Eleanor, who had quietly become fixtures in my week. We shared meals, errands, even silence. There was no effort between us, no need to explain ourselves. We were three women who had learned how to hold space for loss, for joy, for everything in between. One afternoon, while rearranging the bookshelves in the room that had once been Richard's study, I came across an old leather-bound notebook I didn't remember keeping. Inside were pages of my handwriting, long-forgotten entries from the early years of our marriage. I had written about small things: his smile, our first apartment, my hopes for the future. The tone was light, eager, full of belief. I read a few pages, then closed the book gently. I didn't cry. I didn't mourn. I simply set it aside. That girl had loved with all she had. And now I loved her. Not for her naivete, but for her courage. I began working more seriously on my own writing after that. In the evenings, I would sit at the kitchen table and revise my essays from the class. I changed the file name on my laptop from What Remains to A Life Returned. I had no intention of publishing. That wasn't the point. The point was the act itself. Shaping meaning from memory, giving form to experience, not for anyone else's consumption, but because I had a voice again, and it deserved to be used. There were occasional shadows, of course. Moments when a song or scent or phrase would send my mind drifting toward what had been. I once overheard two women in the grocery store talking about a man named Richard, and for a split second, I froze, irrationally, absurdly. But I caught myself, breathed, and kept walking. It wasn't him. Even if it had been, it didn't matter. He no longer held the power to derail a day. And then there were the dreams. Not nightmares, not quite. Where I'd find myself, back in that house, or at the cabin, or sitting across from him at a restaurant we used to visit. In the dreams, he always spoke, but I never heard the words. I would watch his mouth move, but there was no sound. And each time I would stand, walk away, and wake up with a sense of completion I couldn't explain. That winter passed slowly but kindly. I marked the 1-year anniversary of the day he left, not with sorrow, but with ritual. I made a pot of soup. I took a walk in the park. I wrote in my journal. I didn't mention the date to anyone. It was mine, and I didn't need to share it to validate it. Later that night, I opened the small box where I kept letters never sent, the one with the note he had mailed in December, and I removed it. I didn't tear it up or burn it. I simply folded it once more and placed it into the trash, alongside onion peels and tea leaves and other things no longer needed. When I went to bed, the house was still, the air outside clean and cold. I pulled the quilt over my shoulders and let the dark come, not as a threat, but as rest. I was not waiting for anything anymore. I was living, sentence by sentence, on my own terms. Spring returned without asking permission, as it always does, slowly pressing itself into the corners of the world until even the most stubborn winter branches gave in. I noticed it first, not in the blossoms or the changing light, but in myself, in the ease with which I opened the windows, in how I moved through the rooms of my house without thinking of what had been taken from me, but instead of what I had reclaimed. The air felt different, not cleaner or warmer, but freer, as if the house, like me, had exhaled something heavy and was ready to begin again. I began spending more time outside, not just in the garden, but on long walks beyond the familiar streets. I walked farther each week, exploring paths I had only ever driven past before. There was something about the motion of walking that loosened things in me, helped thoughts rise and fall without needing to be solved or tamed. I no longer walked to get somewhere. I walked to remember I was not standing still. One afternoon, on a whim, I took the train into the city, something I hadn't done in years. The idea came to me while washing dishes, and within an hour, I had packed a book, a scarf, and a bottle of water. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one I needed to explain myself to. I arrived mid-morning and wandered without aim, stopping at a museum I had once loved and sitting in front of a painting I used to teach my sons about when they were small. I bought lunch from a street vendor and ate it on a bench in the sun, people passing around me like river current. I felt no longing, no loneliness, only calm. I was alone, yes, but not abandoned. There's a difference. And I had come to understand it intimately. When I returned home that evening, tired in a good way, I passed by the mirror in the hallway and caught sight of my reflection. For the first time in a long while, I looked exactly like myself. Not a woman hurt or healing or overcoming, but simply a woman who had come through something and was still here. Not reduced, not erased, still here. In the following weeks, I found myself reaching toward new things. I started a small herb garden on the windowsill, learned how to make fresh pasta from scratch, joined a monthly cinema group hosted by a local retired professor. These weren't acts of distraction. They were acts of reclamation, not of time or space, but of joy. Small, unremarkable joys I had once assumed were for other people, younger people, people untouched by betrayal. But I understood now that joy was not earned. It was claimed, moment by moment, without justification. It was around this time that a man named Peter joined our writing group. He was in his early 70s, a retired teacher, quiet, observant. At first, we barely spoke beyond group discussions. But over time, our conversations stretched. A shared walk to the parking lot, a comment about a passage one of us had read, a knowing smile when another member dominated too much of the session. He wasn't flirtatious. He wasn't eager. He was simply present, in that rare way some people are when they've made peace with their own company. I didn't think of him as a possibility. I didn't think of him as anything other than a person who made space feel easier. Then one evening, after a particularly intimate reading about family estrangement, he walked beside me down the steps and said, without preamble, "I admire how you write about silence. Most people avoid it. You move through it like you've learned its language." I didn't respond right away. I hadn't thought of it like that. But it stayed with me, not because it was a compliment, but because it was true. I had learned to live inside silence without fear. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to share that space. He asked, weeks later, if I'd like to get coffee. I said yes. There was nothing dramatic about our first outing. We talked about books, the absurdities of aging, the way grief doesn't come in waves but in weather systems. He didn't ask about Richard. I didn't ask about his past. It was enough to sit across from someone who asked questions without agenda and listened without interruption. We began meeting once a week, sometimes for walks, sometimes coffee, sometimes a gallery, or talk at the library. It was never defined, never discussed. I liked it that way. There was no pressure to perform or decide, just time shared without cost. One day, as we sat on a bench near the lake, watching a pair of geese fight over something invisible, he said, almost absently, "I like how you never fill the air just to avoid the quiet." And I answered, "I spent too many years doing exactly that." He nodded, and that was it. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "Closeness doesn't always begin with desire. Sometimes it begins with relief. The relief of being seen without being expected to vanish into someone else." That spring, I did not fall in love, but I fell back into something I had long put away, the possibility of companionship, of being known slowly, of choosing company not out of fear of solitude, but out of respect for it. The past was still with me, but it no longer led, and ahead of me, there was space, not empty, but open. By late May, the rhythm of my days had become almost musical in its balance. Mornings of quiet intention, afternoons spent in the garden or at the community centre, evenings with a book or a walk around the neighbourhood. What had once felt like empty space now felt lived in, even textured, like the grain of old wood. I no longer measured time by what was missing. I measured it by what I was making. Small joys, new thoughts, occasional laughter shared with someone who understood the beauty of not asking too much. Peter remained a part of my life, but in a way that neither threatened nor consumed. We saw each other once or twice a week, often spontaneously. A phone call in the morning, a question about a film, a suggestion for lunch at the park. There was no discussion of the future, no pressure to define what we were or what we were becoming. At our age, that kind of talk felt unnecessary. We weren't building a life together. We were walking alongside each other in lives we had already built, each carrying our own pasts with quiet honesty. And still, there were moments I caught myself watching him carefully, wondering if some shadow might rise, a trace of condescension, a need to control, the subtle dominance I had once mistaken for protection. But it never came. He was content in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He didn't expect me to explain how I had become the person I was. And I, in turn, didn't try to shape myself into something simpler for his ease. That, more than anything, felt like intimacy, the ability to be fully present without becoming smaller. One afternoon, we visited a botanical garden just outside of town, something he suggested on a whim, saying only, "You seem like someone who'd noticed the little things." We walked slowly along winding paths, stopping to admire whatever caught our attention. At one point, near a cluster of early peonies, he turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think starting over was impossible after 70, but maybe it's just quieter, less dramatic, more earned." I didn't answer right away. There was nothing to add, not really. He had spoken a truth I had only recently come to understand. Starting over wasn't about reinvention. It was about re-inhabiting yourself after being emptied out. It was about noticing the places that still held warmth and building there. That evening, back at home, I opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed, the one where I had once stored linens, then court papers, then old photographs and letters I couldn't yet part with. Slowly, carefully, I began to sort through its contents. Not to erase the past, but to give it its place. I kept a few photographs, some letters from friends who had passed, a handful of mementos that still sparked warmth. The rest, especially anything tied directly to Richard, I packed into a box and sealed. Not in anger, in clarity. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't need it in reach either. The following week, I gave a short reading at our writing group, my first. It wasn't anything dramatic, just an excerpt from an essay about aging, about solitude, about how grief can sometimes feel like being asked to relearn how to live in your own home after the furniture's been moved. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then someone whispered, "Thank you," and another nodded. I didn't need applause. I didn't expect it. I just needed to say the words aloud. That night, I walked home alone. Peter had offered to drive, but I declined. I wanted the air. I wanted the walk. I wanted to feel my own steps, one after another, carrying me forward. As I turned onto my street, the porch light glowing faintly in the distance, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Not the brittle kind that comes from telling yourself you're fine, but the deep, living kind that comes when you no longer need to pretend you're not hurt, because you know you're healing. I still thought of Richard sometimes, not often, and not with longing, more like remembering an illness, the ache, the fatigue, the way it clouds everything. But now I remembered too that I had survived it, that it had passed, that I had returned to myself not by force, not by denial, but by walking every painful step with my eyes open. The world, I realized, hadn't given me this life. I had carved it out with my own hands, not out of stone, but out of softness, steadiness, and refusal. And now, it was fully mine. The second spring passed almost without announcement, as though the earth itself had learned that not everything needs to be grand to be real. Buds appeared on branches that had once looked irreparably bare. The wind grew softer, the light gentler. And I, moving through the rooms of my home with the quiet certainty of someone who had taken every inch of it back, understood that time doesn't heal all wounds. It simply makes space for what can grow around them. It had been nearly 2 full years since Richard left, though it felt both closer and further away, depending on the hour. Sometimes it struck me suddenly, the fact that I had once been someone's wife for almost 5 decades, that I had planned dinners and budgets and holidays with a man who, in the end, could vanish with a voicemail and a forged signature. But those thoughts no longer hurt. They simply sat beside me like old acquaintances, familiar but no longer welcome, their power dulled by the work I had done to reclaim myself. I had not spoken to him since the court settlement. I never reached out, and he never tried again after that last empty holiday card. There was nothing left to say, no debt between us that could be settled by words. What needed to be said had been spoken, not to him, but to myself, and it had been heard. One morning in early May, I received a call from the lawyer who had managed the property division. Not Clara, who had since retired, but a younger associate who handled the final details. "We just wanted to let you know," she said, her voice professional but soft. "The cabin is officially, fully, and uncontestedly yours. All claims have been cleared." I didn't cry. I didn't even sit down. I simply thanked her, hung up the phone, and stood for a moment with my hand resting on the counter. I looked out the window at the garden, where the first blooms of peony and iris were beginning to open. I had not been back to the cabin since the settlement. Not because I couldn't, but because I hadn't known whether I wanted to. It had once been a place filled with hope, then silence, then betrayal. Now, it waited. That weekend, I packed a small bag and drove north. The road was familiar, though I took it slowly, stopping once for coffee, once to stretch my legs. The drive used to be shared. Him at the wheel, me checking directions, sometimes singing along to a radio that buzzed with static. Now it was quiet, but I did not feel alone. I felt accompanied by the self I had become. When I pulled into the gravel drive, I sat in the car for a few moments before stepping out. The cabin stood just as I remembered, but it no longer held the same weight. It wasn't a memory. It was a structure. Wood, roof, stone, waiting to be reimagined. I unlocked the door. The air inside was stale but clean, the furniture exactly where it had been left. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching nothing at first. Then, without ceremony, I opened the windows, stripped the beds, rolled up the rugs. I wiped dust from shelves, opened the cupboards, made a mental note of what I would keep and what I would replace. It was not a home yet, but it could be. And for the first time in a long time, that thought felt like possibility, not burden. That evening, I lit a fire. I cooked a simple meal: roasted vegetables, bread, cheese, wine. and sat on the porch as the last light drained from the sky. There were no sounds but the wind and the rustling of trees, no voices, no questions, no expectations. Just me, in a place I now owned completely, not because someone gave it to me, but because I had taken back what had been stolen, legally, emotionally, spiritually. I stayed 2 nights. I slept deeply. I dreamed of nothing. When I returned home, I brought with me a single item from the cabin, a ceramic bowl I had once found at a roadside stand during a trip long ago. It had a crack running through one side, repaired long ago with gold resin in the old Japanese style of kintsugi. I placed it in the center of my dining table. That summer, I began writing in earnest, not just for myself, but with the intention to share. I completed a manuscript, not a memoir, not exactly, but a book of reflections and essays about aging, betrayal, repair, and joy. I gave it a name that had come to me one evening just before sleep. Not left, but let go. I submitted it to a small independent publisher, expecting nothing. 2 months later, I received an email. They wanted to publish it. I didn't tell many people. Joyce cried when she found out. Peter took me to dinner and toasted with water because we were both too tired for wine. I didn't throw a party. I didn't post online. I simply sent my story into the world and let it move without me. By the time the book came out, my hair had fully silvered. My body ached in new places. But I had never felt stronger. Not in the way people mean when they say you're so strong, as a way to deflect your pain, but truly resilient, rooted, self-determined. The kind of strength that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that stands in a room alone and feels full. One morning that autumn, I woke before dawn and stood by the window, holding a cup of tea. The sky was the color of ash, just beginning to pale. I thought about everything that had happened. The years of quiet erasure, the final blow, the fight, the rebuilding. And I realized something I hadn't put into words until that moment. I had not just survived what was done to me. I had undone it. Not with revenge, not with cruelty, but with boundaries, with truth, with time. There was no final confrontation, no apology that made things whole, no tearful reconciliation. Only the simple, powerful fact that I had not disappeared. I was still here, and I had chosen myself, not once, but again and again, every day, in the smallest ways, in meals cooked just for me, in mornings walked alone, in friendships nurtured without pretense, in rooms filled with nothing but light and quiet breath. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the ability to live your life without looking over your shoulder. And peace? Peace is when you no longer wonder if they regret it. You've moved too far beyond to care.